Delighted to have our guest here. She is a New York Times best-selling author and the author of the Substack, How Project 2025 Will Ruin Your Life. Andra Watkins has graciously agreed to stay for another segment because there's just so much to break down about this. Andra, for people who are just joining us, we're talking about the Christian nationalism influence on Project 2025 and things that are kind of embedded within it. You had mentioned, Andra, that you read the whole thing. I spent 2.5 hours one Saturday trying to wade through it, and it's exhausting. It's exhausting because, as you said, it's not written to be an easy, engaging read.
No.
No, and they front load it with a lot of really boring stuff. The whole first section is what the executive branch should do with each person who works in it. So it's very boring and dry. It really takes getting to Roger Severino's section on health and human services to start finding a lot of their really scary culture war, Christian nationalist rhetoric very overtly stated. And that's on page 400 and something. So you really have to persevere to find a lot of the really overt stuff in it.
Well, now they want to get rid of the Department of Health and Human Services and turn it into what? The Department of Life.
They want to call it the Department of Life. They also want to transform the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention into a pregnancy and transgender surgery tracking unit. So it wouldn't, they say they want to track abortions, but in order to track abortions, they would have to track all pregnancy outcomes. So they wouldn't just be tracking how many abortions happened. They'd be trying to find out why someone miscarried and if that miscarriage was something that was their fault. And we already see that happening in red states. I mean, Alabama incarcerates more pregnant women for harming their children in the womb than any other state in the country. And they'll incarcerate a woman for taking medicine, for example, and endangering an unborn child. So that kind of thing is already happening in some red states.
And we're talking about women who may need chemotherapy or
And
some other, right?
Right. And people deny that under, I can't in good conscience. I have this religious conscience objection to treating this because it's endangering this unborn human being. And so, you know, they're using it to harm women in all kinds of ways, to deny them health care, to incarcerate them for doing things that might endanger their pregnancy. Some busybody thinks that. And so they are incarcerating women. And so they would transform the CDC into that kind of unit. They would also do away in large part with the National Institutes of Health and a lot of the medical research that they do that doesn't just benefit Americans. I mean, that benefits the whole world. But they want all of that privatized. And one of the reasons we have the National Institutes of Health is because it's a government-funded entity and it doesn't have to make a profit. So they can invest in things that may completely go awry because it doesn't matter whether they make a profit or not. So, you know, if they privatize the whole National Institutes of Health, it will absolutely throw a wrench in all of our medical research and medical advances that we've made.
Andrew, something I wanted to, you know, we've been talking about so not as long as you have, of course, but we've been talking about Project 2025 for some time. And we kind of knew that there was something happening here when we saw John Oliver cover it. But one of the things that we really were talking about in detail was the fact that it's also a way to rework the government existing on an executive level so that Trump would be a dear leader, all would come from him. He is the best, the brightest, the only, no experts, only loyalists. And what I'm wondering is, how did the Christian national side of it square that? Because I know that a lot of fans of his, when you look at you like, well, he's 3 times divorced, he's done all these things. They say he is a flawed man, and he is, you know, our Cyrus.
Mm-hmm.
How do they square all of that? How do they make, you know, their mission to make it the most godly country through Project 2025 through this broken vessel of Donald Trump?
Well, first of all, I want to say that the Supreme Court's already made it possible for a president to be a dictator. They've already
Mhm.
declared that the president is above the law. So that's an aim of Project 2025. They've paved the way for the president to have all power centered in his office, to fire as many federal servants and civil service as he wants and replace them with loyalists who are sycophants who will do whatever he says, whatever that is. So we already have that happen, and the Supreme Court has made that possible. Joe Biden won't behave that way, but that doesn't mean somebody else who's more nefarious won't behave that way. Now, to answer your question about Trump, I don't talk about him very much. In fact, on my
You're so
Substack,
lucky.
I call him 45. I can't even stand to say his name.
Yeah.
But he does not deserve our attention. The people behind him do. The people behind him are the people we should be talking a lot more about, because they're really the ones who have dug in and worked for 50 years to get us to this point. The Leonard Leos, for example, he has been
Yes.
working on this for decades. Josh Hawley has been working on this his entire professional life. So we have people who are highly radicalized behind him. He is the empty vessel that they were able to flatter and frill up and make think he's great. You know, he's the best tool for them to gain power. And I've even said if he won in November, they'd let him probably have his bloody retribution fantasy, because it would get rid of a lot of their enemies and it would help serve their purposes. And then they'd trot out and say, oh, so sad, too bad. Our mighty leader died in his sleep last night. And then we'd have J.D. Vance, who's a hardcore Catholic Christian nationalist, as our president, and he could be dictator for 30 or 40 years, because that's really the kind of person they want. But Americans probably aren't going to elect one of them because they don't have the charisma that Trump has for whatever reason. So to me, that's the way they'd accomplish. You know, he's a tool. He's a means to an end.
Yep.
And so they use him for that reason. So we should be talking a lot more about the people behind him and
Andra
how
Watkins.
dangerous they are.
Andra Watkins is our guest. She is a New York Times bestselling author and also the author of the Substack, How Project 2025 Will Ruin Your Life. We're talking about the Christian nationalist influence on Project 2025. It is woven all throughout it. Andrew in Maine on the live stream has a question. So how come none of these Christian nationalists have adjusted the laws to prevent mixed material fabrics? And that is an interesting square to, how do I circle this square, or how do I square this circle? Yeah, we're going to stone adulterers to death because that's in the Old Testament, but we're not going. You can get a tattoo now, even though you're not supposed to if you read Leviticus.
I can eat shrimp.
Yeah, can't do that. I mean,
Yeah.
so how do they massage that?
Well, they are very selective in how they read the Bible. So they pick the things that serve their narrative and they ignore the rest of it. And that's not to say that someone who's more radicalized wouldn't come along and say, Andrea, you have to get rid of your tattoo that looks like Satan. You know, that's not to say that someone wouldn't come along at some point and enforce more of those, well, you can't eat bacon anymore kind of laws that are in the Old Testament. You know, right now they talk about the ones that serve their narrative and speak to what they're trying to accomplish the most.
Andrew, we mentioned earlier in the show that we have been accused of being hyperbolic, scaremongering, being too afraid because this Project 2025 isn't something that people know about. I got friends who don't know about it, and they're hardcore Trump MAGA Republicans. They don't know about it. All these things trying to paint us as alarm setters. You come from that world, the Christian nationalist world. You, in another life, would have probably voted for Donald Trump with your upbringing. What do you say to people who say that to you, to us, to anyone who wants to bring light to this horrible book, this horrible plan that's going to rework the fabric of this country?
I have on both sides of my family, because I told Jane my husband's from Milwaukee, so I have family in Wisconsin. And we don't waste time talking to people on that side about anything anymore. I don't talk to my parents about it. I don't try to convince any Christian nationalists or anybody in the MAGA camp that this is something to take seriously. They're hopeless. So my approach has been to try to persuade persuadable people. So I have libertarian Republicans that understand that this is a recipe for huge, monstrous government intervention in our lives, who don't want this, and they've seen that. And they're reachable. Independent voters are reachable. Lots of Democrat voters have become more energized and more engaged because of reading my Substack and going, this is the worst thing ever, and I need to get more involved to stop this. So that's where I'm focusing my energy and my time, and I don't waste my breath on anyone on the right anymore. If they have not taken one of the many off ramps that they have been given by now, they're not going to take one. And so I give them up to that.
And it's just interesting, again, as we talked about when we first began, they think that they're going to be immune. They think that
Yes.
that whatever flavor of Christianity they are, that's going to be okay. That's not going to be okay.
No, they will have a holy war about which flavor is going to be forced on everyone. They get into the same bed now, even though Leonard Leo and Mike Johnson probably hate each other in private. They don't believe the same things about who's going to heaven. And so they're going to have to fight about that after they have power.
Andra Watkins has been our guest. Thank you so very, very much for taking this much time with us. We would love to have you back before the election.
I'd love to come back. I'd be happy to do it.
We will put all of her links in our show notes after the show is over. Thank you so much, Andra. We will talk to you again very, very soon.